Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for another one of the IWRS seminars. We're really looking forward to the conversation today about pain and flexible behavior in crickets. So we've got Kate Lynch and Tom White with us today from the University of Sydney, a philosopher and an entomologist. Always, it's pleasing to me to have some philosophers represented in the conversation. So grateful that you've joined us today, and we're really excited to hear about your work. We will, as is our custom, go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So we're looking forward to having a chance to discuss their work with them, and we will just let you take it away. Thanks so much for being here, Kate and Tom.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will just minimize you if anything ends. Just, oops, sorry, 1 second. I've done the opposite. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Got it. All right. Okay. So thanks for having me. As Bob mentioned, my name, I'm a philosopher of science. I do have a bit of a biology background, including doing a little. I met my colleague Tom, who's an entomologist. So we'll both be available in Q&A to hopefully be able to answer questions on both sides of that. And we will talk about our cricket study a little bit today, but I'm going to talk a bit more generally about this broader project that we're on, where we're interested in whether insects are sentient, and more about, for this talk, what constitutes good reasons to believe that they might be. So I'm going to focus on pain today. I think it's important to think about pain. There's the moral significance of pain that there might not be for other sentient states, and most of the literature does focus on pain when we're looking at sentience in non-human animals. But we are interested in other forms of sentience as well, and the moral significance of those kinds of things. And again, in question time, maybe we can get into that. So I want to start with this very kind of broad question about who feels pain. This is the kinds of things that philosophers of science are interested in this literature. And it starts very broad because depending on your degree of skepticism, everything on this screen could be up for grabs if you were a philosopher. Now, I think most scientists, philosophers, and laypersons would at least concede that other humans feel pain. This is based on some sort of inferences about other humans being similar to us. We all accept that we have a subjective experience of something like pain. And also, the specific thing about humans is that we can express our pain in language. We can tell people when we're in pain. Not all humans, of course, can communicate their pain. So young infants can't communicate their pain. And there is even quite a recent history about, where there's a bit of controversy about whether newborn babies can feel pain in the same ways we can, in part because they can't communicate it and because people think they've kind of developed in a different sense. And so one way you could attack this question, thinking about who feels pain, is to look at a physiological, or more specifically, a neurological route, where we accept that humans feel pain, and in humans, because we can self-report our pain, we've got a pretty good idea about or a fairly good idea, I should say, of correlates of pain in the brain. So kind of functional correlates and structural correlates that we think relate to pain experiences in humans. And then we can go out into the animal kingdom and see, which other organisms have similar kinds of brains or similar kinds of nervous systems, structurally and functionally. And so this is one approach that people have taken when they try to make inferences about pain in other organisms. Now, one limitation to having a neurophysiological approach is this problem of multiple realizability, where, so if we take a different kind of example, something you might think is a different kind of conscious experience, like the ability to see. This is something that we think is and fairly regularly accepted, that is multiply realized across the animal kingdom. There's all sorts of different kinds of eyes. There's pinhole eyes and camera eyes and compound eyes. These have evolved several times independently, and they all give rise to vision and what we expect is a visual experience. But they have very different corresponding physiological bases. And so people have criticized the neurophysiological approach because of this problem of multiple realizability. It might be that there are things out there with very, very different physiologies, very different brains, very different nervous systems. And even though they don't look like us in that sense, they still could be experiencing something like pain in a similar way to the way that humans do. And so an alternative approach to figure out or to tackle this question of who feels pain is to be agnostic about the underlying mechanistic and physiological underpinnings of pain, and instead to take a behavioral approach, which is the approach that Tom and I are most interested in. Now, when people try to look at pain-related behaviours, the first thing they do is to distinguish behaviours that are indicative of pain, which is a subjective, negatively valenced experience, and behaviours that are instead more reflective of something called reflexive nociception. And I've listened to a few of these seminars on YouTube. And quite often, when people talk about pain, within the first 10 minutes of these talks, people are making these kinds of distinctions. Okay, if we're looking at behavioral evidence, the first thing we have to do is rule out that the behavior is simply reflexive nociception. So all of these here are quotes from people who are interested in pain in non-human animals, and they're saying exactly this, that unlike nociception, which is this simple reflex behavioral response, pain is a complex emotional state. This is Robert Elwood talking about his hermit crabs. Behavioral responses seen are not mere nociceptive reflexes, rather they're consistent with predictions of pain experience. And thus sentience, so a particular kind of behavior. And then prolonged behavioral alterations, where authors would argue this is indicative of the discomfort associated with pain. Pain-related behaviors and reflexive nociceptive behaviors model, where if there's a noxious stimuli, there's two ways that an animal might respond. They might go through a nociceptive pathway where it's an unconscious response. So the closed eyes here are representing sort of a lights off, non-conscious experience, where there's some perception through the body. There's a reflex action that then moderates some sort of aversive behavioral response. And in humans, we have these kinds of reflex actions. In fact, we have these reflex actions in response to pain. We have the nociceptive flexion reflex. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, then you will rapidly withdraw that hand before you have any subjective experience of pain, and that withdrawal will not be accompanied by any sense of volition, any sort of sense of control or conscious control over the body. So that would correspond to this nociceptive behavioral pathway. And then, of course, we can have behaviours that are the result of a subjective pain experience, where a noxious stimulus induces some subjective experience of pain. So the lights are on, you're conscious of the pain. And then through a pathway of cognition and sort of intentional volitional action, you move in reaction to that pain, like this gentleman on the screen. So the challenge for people working on animal behavior is, how do you distinguish the two? How do you figure out when something is genuinely in pain and when it's simply behaving according to nociceptive reflexes? And many people have thought about this question, and there's a whole host of different frameworks looking at different indicators which can help us, which can lend some evidence to support that an animal might have a pain-related experience. Now, none of these authors think that there is any single definitive test, or that any of these tests completely prove that an organism can experience pain. But the idea here is there's lots of different potential indicators, and the more that we see an organism display these kinds of indicators, the more that we should consider it a serious sentience candidate. Now, I'm going to focus on one of these particular frameworks, the Birch et al., Crump et al. Framework, where they have 8 different criteria or indicators of pain or sentience more broadly. And of these 8, 5 of them involve behavior. So I'll just be focusing on these behavioral ones. You can see there are also neurophysiological ones when it comes to pain, like the possession of nociceptors and integrative brain regions. So again, looking for things in common with us. So what Tom and I have been interested in is, okay, so we've got these behavioral indicators, and I think some of these behavioral indicators are quite compelling. But we wanted to kind of get to the bottom about what is it about these behaviors that makes it so compelling? What do these behaviors have in common? Why are these 5 behavioral criteria the right ones we should be focusing on? And what is it exactly that they're tracking when we look at pain-related behaviors? And so again, if you go to the literature about what people are saying about these indicators or these kinds of behaviors, we have Feinberg here talking about all of those behavioral criteria, and they are directly referring to the Crump Birch et al. Criteria. What's characteristic about them is that they're non-reflexive. Okay, so this again kind of just supports this idea that there's this two pathways model in mind where you've got either the reflexes or the conscious sentient pain-related behaviors. But we're really trying to down what it means to not be reflexive. And so what we really think is, and it's supported by the way people talk about this in the literature, is that the behavior is sufficiently flexible. And so you can see this is this second paper here is a philosophy paper. Pain and pleasure are thought to drive flexible behaviors. In talking about the debate about fish sentience, behavioural flexibility is brought up as something that's an important criteria. And then Lynn Snedden and colleagues, in response to this De Silva article, go even further to say that behavioural flexibility is a necessary condition for inferring pain from behaviour. And so if we go back to this two pathways model, then we've got the sort of the nociception pathway on one side, and on the intentional action, sort of conscious pain experience pathway, we can replace this intentional action, which of course is very hard for us to infer from other animals, to the search for flexible behavior. Okay, so we're either looking for something that is a reflex behavioral response or a flexible behavior response. And the search for flexible behavioral responses align quite nicely with evolutionary arguments for why we feel pain in the first place. So people generally talk about three different functions of pain, or three different reasons you might think pain has adaptive value, that we might have evolved to have a pain experience. One is to withdraw, so to move ourselves away from the noxious stimuli to avoid further damage to our bodies. But as we've just seen with the nociceptive flexion reflex, that hot stove reflex, you can withdraw from a noxious stimuli even with a reflexive response. Okay, so that can happen even when there's not pain present. However, these latter two functions, learning and recuperation, so learning to avoid something that's been painful in the past, or attending to an injury so that it enable it to heal, so that we don't do further damage to our bodies, these are things that people think we cannot do with reflexes alone. Okay, some sort of flexible behavior is needed sentience sort of facilitates these flexible behaviors that we need to learn and to recuperate from our injuries. And the other thing people talk about when it comes to flexible behavior is that if you can behave sufficiently flexibly, then we can choose context-appropriate behaviors, as well as being able to learn and make complex decisions. So for instance, if you stub your toe badly and you're alone in the house, you might sort of grasp at the toe and make a loud noise and all sorts of exaggerated movements to try to alleviate that pain. However, if you have that same injury but in a different context, so here it's quite late at night and I've got two children sleeping in the next room, if I was to stub my toe right now, I would be using my conscious volition to sort of inhibit some of those responses and be a bit more quiet and subdued about that response. And so depending on the context you're in, you can adapt behavior in response when you're feeling something like pain. Okay, so it looks like flexible behavior is what's key to all of these behavioral criteria underlying evidence for pain. So the next question that we've been interested in then is, what is flexible behavior? How exactly can we understand flexible behavior? And trawling through the literature, it didn't seem like this idea of flexible behavior had really been spelled out very well, at least in this animal behavior literature. There's a little bit of discussion in human psychology, but it looks like they're talking about slightly different things. And so we thought a productive way forward would be to look at the second arm of the two pathway model, which is reflexes, right? If we understand what a reflex is, and flexible behavior is sort of the antithesis of a reflex, it's what's not happening when there's a reflex, then maybe we can understand what behavioral flexibility is. So, so this was the next question then. Okay, well, what is a reflex? And it turned out that even for characterizing what a reflex response is, everybody disagrees. There's a whole wealth of literature from neuroscientists, from physiologists, from behaviorists, trying to understand or to characterize what a reflex is. This paper on the screen reports a discussion from a workshop in 1998 by the Neural Control of Movement Society, and it was a group of neuroscientists and physiologists who got together to try to come to a consensus definition on what a reflex was. And basically the conclusion was that there was huge amounts of disagreement, and instead they wrote up this paper characterizing all sorts of features that people had discussed that might be applicable to reflexes, although in many cases there were counterexamples. So some of these features might be useful then for understanding what a reflex is and what the converse of flexible behavior is. And one of the first features that people described in this paper, and this also is in line very much with the history of the discovery of reflexes and the discussion of reflexes, is that reflexes are automatic, that they occur without any conscious volition or sense of control, and then that they're also not suppressible. Toe, and in particular kinds of contexts, I might want to suppress my behavioral reactions. Reflexive responses are not like this. We do not have kind of conscious control or volition over our reflexes. Now, this is related to the history of this idea of a reflex, and it's also discussed in more recent literature on disorders of consciousness, where there are guidelines to try to differentiate reflexive non-intentional behaviors from conscious ones when assessing humans with disorders of consciousness. But defining reflex in this project by conscious volition becomes a bit circular, because what we're trying to do is look for characteristics of kinds of behaviors that we can then use to infer something like pain or subjective experience. And so for our project, at least, defining a reflex by its lack of conscious volition was not a particularly useful feature, except that it sort of supports this two pathways view. Some of the other suggestions, though, we have found a bit more helpful. So people have talked about reflexes as being simple behaviors. They're simple stimulus response reactions. Reflexes are predictable. They're reproduced in the same way across contexts. They're repeatable and they're stereotyped. Reflexes are characteristically rapid. They're very fast reactions to stimuli, and they often do not persist for very long after the stimulus has ceased. They're invariant. They're usually not modifiable, right? They're not suppressible. They are the same across every context. I'm going to have the same sort of reflex reaction whether my children are sleeping in the next room or not. And reflexes are also thought to not be learnt. So some people use this term innate. The term innate is a rather contested, complicated term, especially in philosophy of biology. But reflex behaviors are at least not learnt in the way that you might think some other kinds of pain responses are. And these kind of ideas that comes more out of the neuroscience and physiology literature is reflected in this literature on animal behavior as well. So in this book by Feinberg, which is about animal behavior and sentience, they state that in general, reflexes are faster, more hardwired, automatic, and stereotyped, and more likely to be innate and not require learning. So that sums up a whole lot of those features. And so what we sort of found by looking at this characteristic or definition of a reflex was there's many, many different features that are being pulled out when we're trying to think about what a reflex is. And all of these features, whether we're talking about rapidity or complexity, they're not binary features. We don't think of things as either being rapid or not rapid, right? We can think of the speed of a response and the persistence of a response differing by degree. And that's the same for many of those features on the prior screen, which has led us to believe that it's not very useful to think about reflexes versus flexible behavior, but much more productive to think along a spectrum of reflexive responses, things that are very reflexive and things that are very flexible. And then within this graded way of thinking about reflex to flexibility, we believe there's multiple different dimensions of behavioral flexibility. So I sort of mentioned that reflexes are characteristically rapid, and so we can think about the temporal depth of a behavioral response, where at the reflex end, they're very immediate and fleeting, whereas at the more flexible end of behavior, these are sustained, enduring responses. Reflexes are often characterized as simple as well. So again, at one end of the spectrum, you have very simple stereotyped behaviors, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you could have more complicated behaviors where multiple body parts are coordinated in very specific ways. Okay, so you might have a simple reflex where a whole limb is reacting or discharged, compared to a more complicated pattern of the body where you might have like a more site-directed specific behavior. Reflexes are also kind of characteristically unspecific. So you your reflex kind of either fires or it doesn't. Again, this is this vernacular concept of reflex. There are counterexamples in the physiology literature. Whereas flexible behavior at the other end of the spectrum may be more specific and graded. So in the context of pain, this would mean that, the more painful a stimulus is, the more vigorous response you might have, which again, I think, kind of corresponds to this intuitive way we think about our own behaviors. If I stub my toe a little bit, I'll kind of react in a different way to if I stub my toe very hard. And there is some evidence here from the animal behavior literature as well. For example, in zebrafish, they have these dose-dependent behaviors, abdominal constrictions, depending on the dosage of acetic acid, which is a noxious stimuli. So that is another kind of spectrum that we can think about behavioral flexibility tracking. Context sensitivity also seems important. So a reflex response will be the same kind of stereotyped, repeatable response, no matter the context, okay? No matter kind of whether the children are in the next room or not. So it's invariant, it's immutable. Whereas flexible behaviors, and we'll see that this tracks some of these sentience indicators, some of the Crump et al., Birch et al. Ones, which I'll get to again in a moment. These are behaviors that the nature of the behavior can change depending on either external or internal factors to the organism. So a organism might behave differently to noxious stimuli depending on whether there's predators present, or they might behave differently depending on whether they're hungry. These behaviors can be modified by other things going on in their internal or external environment. And then finally, there's a learning dimension where reflexes are characteristically not learnt. Some people would call this innate, or they're fixed. Whereas a lot of the characteristics of flexible behavior, people have pointed to learning as these sort of important aspects of flexibility and indicators of sentience. And this kind of has this interesting mapping where we do see in the literature people talking about degrees of complexity in learning, where some more kind of simple forms of learning, like habituation and sensitization, are often not thought of as very good evidence for sentience or for pain, in the case of pain. Whereas other more complicated forms of learning, say where there's more of a temporal gap between sort of stimulus and response, that can be better evidence of something like pain. So there's a sort of rough ordering of types of learning that we've got here on the slide. I think there's plenty of work to be done trying to get to the bottom of what exactly this rough ordering is tracking, and what it means to have more or less complex learning. But this is the way that people in the literature tend to talk about learning, particularly in relation to things like pain and sentience. And so what we basically think here is that behavioral flexibility is multidimensional, and it's not as productive to think about reflexes versus flexible behavior as it is to think about the degree of flexibility that a behavior has. And this is not a new idea, that behavioral flexibility can come in degrees. William James in the 19th century talked about semi-reflexes, which were sort of somewhere in between reflexes and flexible behaviors. For instance, if you throw out your arms when falling, this is something that's not sort of straightforwardly voluntary in the way that we might think sentient flexible behaviors are, but it's not a reflex reaction either. There's some sort of flexibility in how you might move your limbs in that way. And so I think that sort of just lends further support to the fact that instead of thinking of a two pathways model where we've got reflex actions and flexible behaviors, we might want to think about a spectrum between these things, right? Rather than thinking of them as completely dichotomous. But as I've just shown you, this spectrum between reflex and flexible behaviors can be further broken down into multi-dimensions. So instead of making this picture on screen really complicated, I'm going to go to this one now, which is a bit of a neater way to visualize things, where we've got our 5 dimensions of behavioral flexibility: complexity, temporal depth, context sensitivity, gradation, and learning. And what we can do now, if we're thinking about different dimensions of behavioral flexibility, is to go back to the behavioral indicators, such as those proposed by Crump et al. And Birch et al., and look at how these different behavioral assays or behavioral indicators track different aspects of behavioral flexibility. So I won't go through all of these just in the interest of time, but I'm going to look at the last 3: flexible self-protection, associative learning, and motivational trade-offs, and kind of map out where these fit on this behavioral behavioral flexibility template. Excuse me. Okay, so to begin with motivational trade-offs. So I think plenty of people in this room are probably familiar with this paradigm. It was sort of characterized first in vertebrates, and now there's quite a lot of invertebrate studies using this behavioral assay. So I'll start with the studies in rats, Carbonac studies in rats, where it was known in rats. There's a lot of behavioral experiments in rats, so we know quite a lot about rats. And it was known in rats in this study that they have certain kinds of food preferences. In this case, the rats that they used, they knew preferred Coca-Cola the most, shortcake the second best, peanut butter, and then what they call chow, rat food, as their final preference. So there was this sort of rank ordering of foods that they preferred. And they also knew the kinds of things that the rats didn't like or that they would avoid. And in this case, it was cold. They don't like getting their tiny little paws cold. And so in a motivational trade-off paradigm, what the experimenters did is they tested to see whether these rats would move through a cold tunnel in order to get food placed at the other end. And the idea here is if the avoidance of cold as a noxious stimuli was a purely reflexive response, then the rats putting a paw on the cold tunnel would jerk away from the cold and would display that same kind of behavior no matter what was placed at the end of the tunnel. But what they found instead, oh sorry, and I should say here that's been found in lots of other vertebrate animals as well. What they found instead is that the rats were more likely to go through that cold tunnel to get to their preferred food, the Coca-Cola, than they would be to get to their least preferred food, the rat food. And the conclusions that were drawn from this study was that the rats have conflicting motivations. They want to avoid pain, the unpleasant experience of putting their paws on a cold tunnel, but they want to seek out something they're enjoying, like the delicious Coca-Cola. And so they've got these conflicting things that they care about, one that's good and one that's bad, that have been weighed up using this common currency. And the common currency is valenced experience, which is why this is thought to be evidence for sentient experience. So that's the study in rats, invertebrates. Now, people have done similar kinds of studies in invertebrates, including insects, including this lovely paper looking at motivational trade-offs in bumblebees. And in this paper, there's actually a combination of this motivational trade-off study and a little bit of learning as well, where the bees, first of all, they learnt to associate a color cue, so either pink or yellow, this was varied between trials, with various sucrose concentrations, either high sucrose concentrations or low sucrose concentrations. So say in the trial, the bee associated the color pink with high sucrose, which is the preferred food. They prefer things to be more concentrated. That's more valuable to them in a positive sense. And so they associated the pink areas with high sucrose. And then they first of all just tested in the arena whether the bees were more likely to go to the ones that they knew had higher sucrose and the ones that they knew had lower sucrose. And what they found was that they went to the higher sucrose feeders. However, then when they noxiously heated some of these feeders, including the high sucrose feeders, they found that the bees would avoid the high sucrose feeders when there was no high sucrose in the non-heated ones. But when they could get high levels of sucrose from a non-heated feeder, then they wouldn't kind of brave that noxious stimulus. They wouldn't go to those high heated feeders. And it again demonstrates the animal trading off this noxious experience of heat in this case, which we think might correspond to pain, and retaining a valuable resource, the high concentration. So they would trade off that pain. They would withstand the noxious heat if there was high concentrations of sucrose that wasn't available elsewhere, but when it was available elsewhere, they wouldn't do this. And variations of this motivational trade-off paradigm have been seen across a whole range of other invertebrates, including hermit crabs, sea elegans, slime molds, which is a very interesting one because they've got very different physiologies. They don't have a nervous system at all, as well as Drosophila and amphipods. And if we look at this motivational trade-off paradigm in reference to these dimensions of behavioral flexibility, we can see that it's basically, the whole point of this test is to look at how changes in context, whether it's an available reward. In other experiments, they might use hunger as a variable, where they have some animals starved and others not. And what's happening is that the behavior is changing depending on the context, right? The rats are only moving through the tunnel when there's really great food at the other end and not when there's less preferred food. Okay, so the behavioral response is sensitive to context. So it's a really good test of context sensitivity. Um, there's some evidence for learning in some of these paradigms. So again, it depends on the different studies, and it can be a little bit complicated mapping these indicators in this way because they do vary depending on different kinds of experiments in different organisms. But in the bee study, there was learning as well, the associative learning of the color cues with the sugar reward. There is potential for looking at gradation in these studies. So if, for instance, in the hermit crab studies, the magnitude of the noxious stimuli, the electric shocks, was varied. And they didn't actually record or at least document corresponding variations in the degree of behavioral response, but this is something that you could analyze in these kinds of tests. But these tests themselves, the way they're set up, they're not direct tests of complexity, right? It could be any kind of behavioral response in terms of the coordination of the body or of temporal depth. The behaviors could be quite fleeting, and that would still align with a motivational trade-off paradigm. So we see a particular kind of profile for the motivational trade-offs when we're looking at all these different dimensions of behavioral flexibility. Now, if we look at flexible self-protection, a different kind of criteria under that same framework, we see that this is going to have a very different kind of profile. So flexible self-protection assays, they relate to behaviors in animals which are persistent and directed behaviors towards a site of injury or a site that has been noxiously stimulated. So in our experiment in the house crickets, this was the antenna. We used a heated probe on the antenna, and then it observed grooming bouts to both antennas to see if there was more of a focus on wound tending or grooming the noxiously stimulated antenna. And the idea behind flexible self-protection is that an animal should be targeting towards the particular area of their body that the noxious stimulus has been applied, but they also should be varying the response. And this is where this flexibility part comes in. Crump et al. Described this as varying the response as if trying out different solutions to the problem of the pain that they're experiencing. And in the study we did with the crickets, so we had one arm of the study where the noxious heat was applied, another where an unheated probe was applied, and another where no probe was applied at all. And this was a study that was just published this year. An honest student of Tom led the study. And we found that when there was noxious heat applied, there was more directed grooming towards the antenna that had experienced that noxious heat, and that behavior was sustained over time, and also that it did vary over time. So what this graph is showing here is grooming bouts, the duration of grooming bouts, and what it shows is that right at the start, when the noxious heat was applied, they would groom, say, for 3 seconds, and then they'd pause, and then their next grooming bout might be a bit shorter, say 2 seconds, and then they'd pause, and then the next grooming bout would decrease again. Okay, and so there was a decreasing duration in grooming bouts, and the grooming would change in this sort of temporal signature over time. And in the invertebrate world, flexible self-protection has again been seen across a whole host of invertebrates, including insects. And again, another one of these studies, the Ullman et al. Is coming out of Tom's lab. Now, if we map this to this framework for looking at flexible behavior, we can see a very different kind of profile compared to the motivational trade-offs. So what these studies really track is complexity, okay, the specificity of directing behavior to a particular body site, the injured site of the body, as well as varied responses over time, which is sort of another aspect of behavioral complexity. I'm so sorry, just pressed the wrong buttons there. It also, at least in our study, has the potential to track temporal depth. So one of the things we were looking for was how long these responses were sustained for over time. And we took this to be evidence of non-reflexivity and some sort of evidence of sentience in the crickets. Um, these studies could also be designed to demonstrate gradation. So we didn't do this in the cricket study, but you could have a look at whether there's more kind of grooming or guarding responses when there's increased noxiousness, so higher heat, for instance. And this kind of thing has been done in vertebrates. In rats, there's a study which looks at increases in grooming, licking, and rubbing, which is dose dependent to formalin injections, which is a noxious stimuli in rats. But it doesn't really say too much about learning, the way that flexible self-protection is set up, and context sensitivity isn't really directly assessed either. You could build in some context sensitivity to an experiment like this. For instance, you could look at whether the grooming behaviors change if there's a predator cue or something in the environment, but really there you're starting to combine some of these behavioral indicators. And then finally, associative learning is another one of these indicators. I'm going to talk about just this one study that I like, which is not on insects, but it is an invertebrate, which is tardigrades, which are tiny microorganisms. And in this study, they were looking at learned aversion to a neutral stimulus. In this case, it was blue light, which they managed to induce after just a single pairing of the light to a noxious stimulus. So in this Zhu et al. Study, they first of all tested the stimulus to see if they could get a aversive response, which is this C curl response that the tardigrades exhibit when they're electrically shocked. And it's a very small part of the paper, but they do actually mention that in their piloting of the electric shocks, they found some sort of graded, what looks like graded or kind of dose-dependent responses to the degree of electric shock. And then they did some associative learning where they took a neutral stimulus, blue light, and I think we can visualize this here, where they shone blue light at the tardigrades and then gave them a shock right at the end of the exposure to that blue light. So the blue light was on for 20 seconds and they were shocked for the last 2.5 seconds of that exposure. And then they had a whole series of controls as well, which you can see here. Some just got the blue light, some just got white light, some got the shock before the blue light, and some got the shock with white light just being, sorry, regular ambient light. And they also had it was a bit long to put in the slides, they also had sort of a random control as well. And what they found was that after just this single pairing, they were more likely to do this curl response just with the blue light alone. They tested this at both 1 and 4 hours, and they found there was a bit of a decay in the learning, so they were much more likely to do that curling response after 1 hour than they were to 4 hours. And again, there's some there's growing evidence in the realm of invertebrates that there's associative learning in the context of pain. So we can see this across a whole lot of insects and other invertebrates. There's a very nice study by Robin Crook, which looks at a whole lot of different of these indicators, including associative learning. So finally, if we map associative learning onto this framework where we're thinking about multidimensional behavioral flexibility, as you might expect, it does very well on the learning dimensions, as that's directly what it's testing. I think in some cases it can do quite well in context sensitivity, and you may even be able to make some sort of argument that learning is one variation of context sensitivity, as the behavior is differing in different contexts, such as when the learnt impaired stimulus is present or not. So you might re-describe learning, say, in terms of context sensitivity. There's potential for gradation. So in this tardigrade study, it looked like that body area kind of changed systematically with shock intensity, but it doesn't look like it's been very well examined whether this kind of these graded responses is something that can be built into an associative learning paradigm. But the tests, again, on their own, don't track anything specific to the complexity of behavior or how sustained a behavior is when it's exhibited, so that temporal depth. And so I've just gone through 3, but there are these 5 behavioral criteria in the Crump and Birch et al. Papers. And so what you can do is kind of compare, have a look at them all together to look at this question about, you know, if these tests are thought to track behavioral flexibility, or if we think behavioral flexibility is what is really important when it comes to behaviorally investigating pain and sentience, and these are the features, then how well the indicators do across all of the features. And I think what this reveals is that different studies are tracking different kinds of behavioral flexibility, which is probably a good thing if we're looking at different kinds of indicators. But also that there are some things that are not very well studied and perhaps could be brought in to current experimental paradigms. So gradation, for example, isn't really an essential part of any of these behavioral indicators, although some studies have built them in. And that there are just very different kinds of profiles depending on the behavioral indicator that you're investigating for a particular kind of organism. And I think looking at this is important, and I'll say a little bit more about this as I'm wrapping up. Uh, but looking at this is important when we start comparing species across the broad indicator set and kind of aggregating the data based on whether they've fulfilled indicators or not. The other thing we can do with this framework of pulling apart behavioral flexibility multidimensionally is look at how different taxa might exhibit different dimensions of behavioral flexibility. So I've just got a few that I will show you a graphic of in a moment. I just wanted to sort of say up front that this is, not a representative sample or anything like that of the animal kingdom. And in fact, one of these isn't taxa at all. I've just got the nociceptive flexion reflex in there as a sort of anchoring. This is something that's characteristically reflexive. Okay, we don't think is behaviorally flexible. So I've got that human flexion hand withdrawal reflex. But then these are animals that have either been very well studied or sort of very kind of controversial in the literature, such as, the slime mold. It's just a smattering kind of based on what has received recent attention and what is much discussed when it comes to the behavioral evidence for pain. And what we see if we map this onto this framework of behavioral flexibility is that you get something like the rat that is incredibly well studied. Okay, so we have a lot of evidence that we can draw on to look at the behavior of the rat. Lots of learning studies, lots of well-documented complex sustained behaviors, gradation has been studied directly. And so it does very well across all these aspects of behavioral flexibility. Then you have something that actually also has been quite well studied, which is the larval stage of Drosophila. And I've put that one in there because I think it's important that we think about life history stages when we're looking at indicators of sentience. This is particularly important, I think, for people who are looking at kind of invertebrate welfare in industry settings, where quite often it's the larval stages that might be affected. And the Drosophila larvae, they do have a characteristic C-bend, a little bit like the tardigrades, often followed by a corkscrew roll, which is their behavioral response to noxious stimuli. It's not particularly complex. It's a whole body response. It's not site-directed. They have, physiological constraints so that they can't exhibit this flexible self-protective behavior where things are site-directed. But also I think there's not a lot of behavioral paradigms where the noxious stimuli is at a specific site on the body. Often it's an electric shock to the whole body. It does look like this behavior in Drosophila stops when the stimulus stops. It's not persistent, so they don't do quite so well when it comes to temporal depth. There is some evidence for learning, though, in Drosophila larvae, where they can learn to avoid previously appetitive odors when shocked. So they can have this kind of aversive, this pairing of aversive stimuli to neutral, or in this case, appetitive stimuli. And then I've also got the octopus in there. This is based on a lovely set of experiments by Robin Crook, which looked at conditioned place preference and aversion, directed site-specific grooming, and also response to anesthetic, which I don't have time to go through today, but this is part of why we can see that the octopus also scores quite highly on different dimensions of behavioral flexibility. Now, they don't score very highly, at least this species of octopus, on gradation, but in this case, it's not an absence. It's evidence of absence, not absence of evidence. Oh, sorry, other way around. It's just not something that's been studied directly by Crook or anybody else. This graded response. And then slime molds are in there. Slime molds have presented this sort of problematic counterexample to using motivational trade-offs as an indicator of sentience. But with all the kind of other studies that have been done on slime molds, it looks like they don't score very highly on a lot of these other dimensions. Okay, all right. So why do we think that characterizing behavioral flexibility in this way is important? Well, I think the reason we started out on this project was we were trying to just get to the bottom of what the behavioral tests are actually measuring when they're trying to make inferences about pain and sentience. And currently in the literature, there's quite a lot of vague reference to behavioral flexibility, but no one to date has really spelled out what that means. So that was the first part of why we attempted this project. We also think this way of thinking about behavioral flexibility multidimensionally can help us better understand some of the disagreements that are out there in the literature when people put emphasis, say, on some indicators, such as learning, versus other indicators, such as context sensitivity, as sort of the best indicator for sentience, or in some cases, the only real indicator for sentience. This is some of the discussion that we have going on in the literature to date. I think it's very useful to look at what the assays are capturing and which ones capture more or fewer dimensions of flexibility. And it can also help us look at gaps for future investigation, thinking about how we might modify experimental paradigms to look at animal behavior. When it comes to comparing between species, I think it just gives us a bit of a more nuanced way to compare behaviors between species. So we can look at, where that evidence is lacking because it hasn't been investigated, but also where behaviors might be constrained for sort of evolutionary or ecological reasons. And so just generally what we're trying to do here is characterize this term that's used quite a lot in the sentience and behavior literature, behavioral flexibility, from this loose intuition that's discussed into a more productive roadmap that can facilitate future research. And with that, I'll finish. So thank you very much to friends and collaborators, Tanya Laddie, Daniel Ullman, and Oscar Manzi, and also to our funders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. I really appreciate this. This is a great project, and it's a real service to the community to get some of this stuff mapped out. I'll just mention quickly here, this is a great time, folks. Put your questions in the Q&A section or the chat. Make sure that you ask anything that you want. We'll allow a queue to form here, so please add any questions that you have in the 10 minutes that we have remaining for conversation. I'll just begin while we're waiting for other folks, to write down what they have in mind. As I guess I'm curious how you think about context sensitivity specifically. I guess as I was listening, I can see why there has been so much emphasis on this one. And at the same time, you could imagine someone thinking like, it's the one where the slime mold's doing best. Maybe this is a good reason to think it's actually the least interesting when it comes to evidence for sentience, and that actually it's been a bit of a distraction because people have thought that, oh yeah, just, the specificity of the response is the thing that we should be focusing on, when in fact, that just isn't particularly relevant. So, I'm just, feel free to, free associate a little bit, but I'm curious what you think about the evidential value of that one specifically in light of the map that you've developed.
Yeah, so I guess at the moment we're fairly agnostic about whether any of these dimensions, sort of just assuming in that mapping that they've almost got equal weighting, which I don't know if that is sort of the fairest thing to assume, but it's we're not sure how we would weight, it takes a lot more assumptions we need to build in a lot more assumptions to kind of weight them any other way but equal. I found the motivational trade-off stuff the most compelling when I first heard about it until I found out about the slime molds and then had exactly that sort of same journey. So I think thinking about it along a spectrum is another way that can sort of help. So we're not looking at, is it sort of is completely invariant or there is some context sensitivity. If we think there's degrees of context sensitivity, then you might have reflexes and then whatever the slime molds can do, and then other animals which display really, really context sensitive behaviors where, you vary their internal states and their external states in lots of different ways and you get lots of different varied responses. I think that's going to be even more compelling. So I think you can maybe get around some of the problems people have had with slime molds and C. elegans and stuff passing this indicator test by putting it further, like more in the middle of that dimension. I don't know if Tom has any comments on this as well.
Not especially, except to my understanding, that's also just because that's where the literature leans so heavily, and that's where those, on the adaptive side of things, that's where the kind of common currency, evaluative currencies sort of tests. Sorry, that's the test that seems to be most centered on that concept of goodness and badness coming into context and being weighed in this common currency approach. So I can understand in some senses why the literature leans on it as heavily as it does. But yeah, I guess the goal here wasn't necessarily to adjudicate on those kinds of things. It's just something that is leaned upon quite heavily, so it goes in. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it also seems like the yeah, I mean, the more you learn about the mechanisms behind what produces motivational trade-off behavior in um, C. elegans or other kinds of animals, the more it does start to feel like, oh, well, um, like why not think similar kinds of mechanisms are doing the same work in ostensibly more complex organisms? And so then, sure, that will be moderated by various other sorts of factors, but not entirely clear why that should matter for our thinking about their evidential value. I mean, I realize, like, as a diagnostic framework for mapping literature, right? I mean, this is not a criticism of any of that. It's purely
Yeah.
a question about, like, oh, well, as I'm trying to think about someone, as someone who has spent a lot of time, as you were saying, Kate, focused on that particular aspect. I now find myself thinking like, oh, maybe I care mostly about this things about like the temporal depth, as it's some on the assumption that like, oh, all these other mechanisms appear to decay and not be nearly as stable. But if you have some much more stable bit of learning, maybe that is the kind of thing that a bit of conscious remembering would be involved in doing in a way that you wouldn't have in other organisms. Purely spitballing here, but just starting to kind of process the significance of what you've done.
Yeah, I think maybe that this is where the most productive thing would be to recognize that there's multiple different dimensions that the different tests are tracking, and to come up with experimental designs where you've got you're measuring a few things. So in some cases, you might even be able to have the same sort of experimental setup, but you're just observing and recording more information, say about the how sustained the response is, or you could slightly vary the input and look to see if there's graded responses. And so you could do that all in a motivational trade-offs paradigm, but you kind of also be looking for these other kinds of features. I think that is the most productive way forward. I still think there is something to context sensitivity generally, and maybe motivational trade-offs are going to be in the middle of this dimension of context sensitivity, and there's a better behavioral paradigm where we can better test more varied responses over more varied contexts. But I don't know exactly what that paradigm looks like.
Yeah, interesting, useful. Has to what degree, as you're thinking about follow-on studies, for instance, to your own cricket work, how has this framework changed the way you're thinking about the kinds of research that you think it's most valuable to do next with those animals?
Maybe Tom can
Oh,
answer this because
yeah.
he's
Oh,
involved in the physical lab.
I think doing some of those, I think exactly those kind of things. So moving away from this idea of, yeah, just testing one thing at a time. But I think increasingly I've found that temporal aspect of some of these things to be a bit neglected, and it's been valuable mapping out or thinking more explicitly about what some of these behavioral tests are getting at in terms of these different dimensions. That little plot that was shown, temporal depth is kind of neglected, but I think, yeah, I don't know, my sense is that might actually be quite a profitable and interesting one. The sort of felt affective valenced experiences do seem to come apart from a lot of what we would call reflexive things, and there are really lovely experiments in humans that you can beautifully pick these things apart in terms of like puffing in people's eyes, and you can
Right.
map out the reflexive versus the kind of long tail of an affective response. And because you've got the verbal report, you can see that those things beautifully come apart. So I think, yeah, it's useful as a guiding tool. And, even on your point about motivational trade-offs, right? I think splicing in some of these other dimensions, some learning or focus, it gives us a bit of a map of where to push. So I think it would be, yeah, I think a bit more multidimensional, and some of our designs would be interesting. But that temporal stuff has particularly caught my attention.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at some of the rodent research and the way it looks like they're engaging in this kind of replay
Mm,
when they're facing certain kinds of choices where there have been aversive stimuli before, and it sort of seems like what's going on there is, remembering pain
yeah,
and
yeah,
actually having some kind of, negative response to the memory.
yes,
And so the temporal depth there seems, you know, not that we can read that back onto
mm,
other cases, but it's sort of very suggestive that, like, now that we actually can unpack these mechanisms in some of these animals, we can start thinking about, well, is it possible that similar kinds of things are explaining differences in temporal depth in other species? But
yep,
a thing to explore.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well, Tom and Kate, really appreciate how generous you've been with your time. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm excited to read the paper version of this. We are grateful for the work that you're doing. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. Great to have you here with us, and we look forward to next time.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
very much for having us. Thanks.
All right. Take care, folks.
Bye.